Hello everybody, my name is Yamil Ramírez and today I'm accompanied by Roberto Molina and we're going to be talking about To Build a Fire by Jack London, and we're going to be approaching it from the psychoanalytical aspect. Before we get into the actual story, we have to understand what psychoanalysis actually is, as this is the method we're going to be using to analyze the story To Build a Fire. And according to an article published by Kendra Sherry, psychoanalysis is the belief that all people possess unconscious thoughts, feelings, desires, and memories. What does this mean? We all share thoughts and feelings, and these feelings are analyzed to try to understand why we have them, how we have them, and how they influence our actions. In this case, we're trying to find out how they influence the author. We're writing the story To Build a Fire. What emotions the protagonist experiences, as in how he gets to feel these ways, and what he does when he feels these emotions, therefore how they affect the story, and what possible relationship these emotions have to the actual author when he writes the story and puts these emotions on the character. To do this, we might need to have a look into the author's background to understand how this background could have influenced his writing and his emotions when he wrote this story. As you could probably tell, this lovely man who's smiling to the right is Jack London. He was born in 1876 and died in 1916. He lived a short life, only 40 years, but this was enough for him to become a recognized author. He went to North Alaska in search of gold during 1897 and 1898 in what was known as the Alaska Gold Rush. A lot of other people also attended to this gold rush for the same purpose of searching for gold. He had to suffer through extremely cold weathers in Alaska, which probably influenced and impacted his writing when it came to writing the story of To Build a Fire. But To Build a Fire wasn't the only story that he wrote. He also wrote other stories. Two of the most popular are called The Call of the Wild in 1903 and White Fang in 1906. Now moving on to the story itself, To Build a Fire. The story which most closely resembles the extremely cold weather found in Alaska. The author obviously gave the main character his own emotions and feelings, emotions which the author himself might have experienced when he was found in Alaska in that extremely cold weather. But in a different way, those emotions could have been just found in the main character and not actually the author, as the author might have been using this as a showing of what you should not do when found in this extremely cold weather, since the character ended up dying. Among the emotions that were felt by the main character, there is denial, arrogance, and selfishness, and even a bit of acceptance in the end. The first one is denial, and this is mostly shown through the early stages of the story, where the character refuses to acknowledge that he's in a pretty dangerous situation regarding the cold. This is seen when the narrator states, "What was a little frost? A bit painful, that was all. It was never serious." This means that the main character did not consider the cold to be very dangerous, even though he knew that cold below 50 degrees is considered extremely dangerous to someone and might even lead to them dying. He knew this and still decided to deny the fact and keep going on his journey, making decisions that disregarded the fact that it was really cold. This might have been a coping mechanism to try and avoid the stress of having to consider the fact that he might die because he's in a really dangerous situation. However, this can also risk his chances of survival, since it means he won't acknowledge the cold as something very dangerous and might underestimate how dangerous this cold really is. This would affect his decision making, as he would not make decisions that would get him out of this situation as immediately as possible, and it would risk his chance of survival. Another trait which is shown in the story in the main character is arrogance, which in this case could be considered a state of mind, more than it could be considered an emotion. Arrogance involves someone overestimating their own self-worth and underestimating other people's worth, in consequence ignoring their opinions because they think they are better than them. In this case, that's what the main character did. He refused to acknowledge the old man's advice, which was that no man should go to a cold weather below 50 degrees by themselves, as it could be very deadly to them. He didn't listen to the old man and still went to the really cold weathers, and at the same time overestimated his own ability, because he thought that even though it was known that below 50 degrees could be dangerous, he was somehow better than that cold and could survive the situation, and refused to acknowledge that this can be harmful to him and lead to his death, which was previously stated to be denial as well. The man slowly realizes that he was wrong, and this inability of him to accept his situation led to him having poor judgment and not listening to others. He realized that the old man was right, in which he admitted in the story and said the old man on Sulphur Creek was right. He fought in the moment of controlled despair that followed. This proves that when he was closer to death, he was actually letting go of these emotions of state of mind, such as arrogance and denial, as he was actually trying to understand why he was in that situation and how it could have been avoided. He understood that by denying that the cold was dangerous, he was leaving himself vulnerable to the extremely cold weather, and it was probably going to lead to his death. It is by now very clear that arrogance is not a good trait to have when you're trying to survive and should be avoided when found in a situation such as this, which further proves the theory that maybe this author put in this state of mind that the character had of arrogance to show the reader what they should not do when found in an extremely dangerous situation such as the one where the character was found. Even the character himself let go of his arrogance when he realized he was close to death, proving once more that arrogance is not good when you're trying to survive.
Denial is not only seen in the way he doesn't accept that his situation is a dangerous one, but is also seen in the way he doesn't accept his own death at the end. It can be interpreted that he accepts the fact that he's not going to survive because he lays on the ground and gives up, but as soon as he does this, he starts imagining himself with his friends looking at his own dead body. As it says in the line, standing with the boys and looking at himself in the snow, page 79. He completely disconnects from his own reality and starts seeing everything that is happening and that will happen to him from a spectator point of view. Evidence from this disconnection is the line, he did not belong with himself anymore, also page 79. This disconnection of him imagining his own death from a spectator point of view occurs because, as Sigmund Freud says in his book The Interpretation of Dreams in the page 2089, for humans it's impossible to imagine their own death if it isn't from a spectator point of view, because death will mean that you will cease to exist. So in that imagination of what will happen if you die, you are still present, at least as a spectator. So the human is not really imagining their own death. They are just contemplating some scenario. Selfishness is another attribute that can be seen in the man, especially in the way he treats the dog. He is willing to do everything he can to be safe and to survive, this including putting the dog in dangerous situations and even trying to kill him. Situations like this occurs in page 68, where the man senses danger and he makes the dog go ahead, and in the page 76, where he tries to kill the dog but fails. As the article Are People Naturally Inclined to Cooperate or Be Selfish states, humans, even empathetic people, can turn selfish in survival situations. But with the man of the story, we see this negative attribute since the beginning. We see that he was cold and that he had a lack of empathy. There was no real emotional bond between him and the dog. It was like the dog was the slave of the man, as it states in the page 70. This led to the dog not feeling any kind of love towards the man. He didn't feel that he had to protect him. He didn't care if the man was in a dangerous situation. Maybe if they had an emotional bond, if the man treated the dog with love, maybe the dog will have tried to save the man. Maybe the dog will have tried to avoid the man being in a dangerous situation. But because this wasn't the type of relationship they had, the dog just didn't care. The story concludes with the man dying in what could have possibly been an avoidable situation. Arrogance and denial lead the man to downplay the environment and overestimate his own ability to survive. Unselfishness, even though it can help humans in certain type of situations, in this specific situation, it led the man to lacking of some type of instinct help that the dog could have provided. All of these negative attributes concluded with the man sleeping till his death. Perhaps the author wrote this story based on a personal experience of what not to do when in a survival situation and what kind of attributes and attitudes lead to someone not surviving. This story is written in a way that at the end, when the main character dies, the reader doesn't feel any kind of sadness or nostalgia. This is because since the beginning, the author exposes negative attributes, negative attitudes, and even comments that the main character makes that makes the reader unconsciously think about that man as a bad person. We know that he had been advised, and we know that he chose not to follow that advice. So when he dies, it seemed like a consequence of his own decisions and his own attitudes. We know that he was a cold man, that he had lack of empathy. So at the end, when he dies, we see it as a consequence of all of his attitudes toward the story, especially with the dog when he tries to kill the dog. At the end, there's even a kind of irony because in some point the man tries to kill the dog, but at the end it's the man that dies and it's the dog that survives. All of these negative attributes of him not following advice, of him being arrogant, of him being in denial of the danger of the situation he was in, of him thinking about himself as an invincible man, of him being cold and having lack of empathy towards the dog, resulted in his death and resulted in us as readers feeling the same way the dog felt, not feeling sad about his death.